Hello, buddy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us for another session on our generative AI and automation conversation series. As always, we're super excited to have you here. Another great panel. So be sure to have your questions ready. This week, I am joined by Micah Smith. Micah, how are you?
I'm well. Today's bittersweet. This is the last day of Bot Games Season 4, which was a super exciting event, and we had a lot of great participation. So sad to see it go, but also it's a lot of work for our team. So a little bit happy and looking forward to the next one.
It was incredible. For our audience, Micah, that might not know what Bot Games is, give them a quick overview.
Yeah, so Bot Games is our developer style challenge events, and we create these challenge pages that are scored for both time and accuracy, and they're designed to be realistic challenges that are representative of real business problems. And Bot Game Season 4 was all about generative AI themed challenges. And so we had a healthcare challenge where you have to parse doctors' notes to try to enter some data into a system of record. We had a shipment processing manufacturing use case where you need to do some really basic translation between state codes and state names. And then we had a resiliency challenge that was all about how do I keep an automation from tipping over, and how do I make sure I can keep entering data into a form regardless of that form seeing some changes, and how do I dynamically pull back a DOM-X path and things like that. So great challenges this season, and it was really great to see so many people from our developer community really starting to explore and understand and pioneer the use of generative AI with automation.
Yeah, it was super cool. For those of you in the audience that aren't familiar with it, if you go on LinkedIn and just type in the search function hashtag bot games, BOTGAMES, you'll see the post from the hundreds of developers and practitioners out there that did the challenges. We had trifecta awards for those that completed all the challenges. We gave away swag. It's one of the biggest automation events, I think, that is in the industry. Actually, it's become its own beast. It's super fun, and the coolest thing is the community sharing their solutions and sharing tips with one another as well. It's a great environment. All right, well, enough about bot games since it's over anyway. For our audience, I know you're all joining because today we are talking about unpacking and diving into the world of generative AI models. And we're going to do that with none other than Mr. Peter White, our SVP of Product for Enterprise AI and Emerging Products here at Automation Anywhere. Peter, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gabe.
We're excited to have you and geek out a little bit. I'm probably just going to hold the wheel and drive and maybe play at the radio while you and Micah just dive in. We also have a special guest from the team, Ramana Lokanathan, who's our VP of Engineering. Sorry, Ramana, I didn't practice the name, but we're glad to have you as well.
We're getting him in the room right now.
This is live, people. This is how it works, right?
There we go. He's in.
Well, is he there? There he is.
Yeah, Ramana, unmute yourself. Let's. Oh, all right.
All right. Well, we're having some minor technical difficulties. No big deal. So, guys, as usual, the topic is around AI and generative AI and automation. But today we're going to talk specifically a little bit about the LLMs and the various models that are out there. But before we do, let's just do a level set. Let's talk a little bit about generative AI, the difference that it is compared to traditional, what we've known to thus far. Now, let me back up. Peter, let's talk about your background a little bit really quick, because you've been in the AI game for a minute, right?
Yeah, so I've only been at Automation Anywhere for about 6 months now, leading our emerging products and AI, but spent 8 years at Salesforce before that, mainly focused on our Einstein products and Einstein for Service Cloud, which was customer service application. And so spent a lot of time building out, various AI capabilities to help customer service organizations and service agents do their job more efficiently and more effectively. And with the advent of the new technologies, like when ChatGPT came out and the generative AI models, it's been by far the most exciting time I've been working on this. And it's just really energizing to see all of the new technologies coming out every day. And all of the application possibilities of this new technology for businesses especially really makes me so optimistic about the future and some of the things we're going to be able to do, especially when it's combined with automation.
Yeah, it really is exciting. Guys, yesterday for the audience, yesterday we had an internal town hall and we had what we call Demo Royale using generative AI for solutions for use cases. And in just over a month's time, we had over 200, I think close to 250 submissions from folks throughout the company. Even I was part of it with some fellow colleagues. And to see the finalists, I think we showed the top 10 yesterday out of the 200, but to see the solutions and to see how people are thinking and what they're doing with the Automation Success Platform to build these solutions, it was mind-blowing. I can't wait to share some of the demos and use cases coming up. So look for that soon. But you guys, Peter and Micah, you guys were on the selection panel, right? And helping to judge the different submissions?
Yeah,
that's right.
It was.
Go ahead, Peter.
Go ahead, Micah. It was really hard to judge because there was, like you said, Gabe, there was 200 submissions. So first we had to look through those, which was a lot of binge watching of generative AI demos. And then, we got down to the final 10 and they were all just really great demos. And I think everyone was, super excited to share some of the things they've built. I personally was impressed that, there were use cases I just hadn't even thought of before. Like, how do you manage refueling aircrafts and using generative AI with their information when you're landing aircrafts at the airport to extract things about fuel and passenger lists and things like that. And it just kind of goes to show you that when you start to open this technology up to so many people who have different business needs, there's just going to be a kind of tidal wave of applications of this. Micah,
Yeah,
what was your
possibilities
takeaway from the judging event yesterday?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said. It was fun. It was great to see like really high quality demos. And I thought were really impressive. I think the other thing was it was amazing how engaged everyone in the organization was in helping to score these themselves and helping us make these determinations. And I think just like you mentioned, I think this is going to only spur further creativity for other people within the organization who saw, a tidbit of something and they say, hey, there's actually another way that could be applied. So I'm excited to see what comes next and the next, following rounds of people seeing those demos and wanting to create more.
And two, for our audience, if you haven't yet, register for our Automation and AI Live event, our virtual event on June 1st. Well, you'll get to see some of these demos and use cases in person. You'll see the real applications and what's possible now, and hopefully spur ideas from you guys to decide what's coming next. We'll put that link in the comments, so be sure to register. It's going to be an amazing event. We've already got thousands upon thousands of registrations, and they just continue to grow every day. So we're super excited about what's to come. It looks like Ramana's in the panel now. Ramana, are you there? Well, looks like we're still having some technical difficulties. We'll figure it out, guys. So going back to this evolution of AI in now to sort of generative AI and what everybody, I think, ChatGPT now to me is like Kleenex, right? It's just the term. It's a brand name, but it's the term that everybody's using for generative AI. Is that true?
I think it's the most widely known. Yeah, that's the one that your grandparents and all your kids are talking about at the dinner table. So it's become sort of synonymous with generative AI at this point.
What are the, so just again, just to level set, what when it comes to generative AI, what are the capabilities and what is it bringing to the table now?
Well, I think if you look at kind of what I want to call maybe the previous generation of AI, it was really about building more application specific models. So models that were targeted to do specific tasks, whether it's to classify something or extract data or do a translation task. And what's really exciting about generative AI is it's much more open-ended because it's now generating content, including generating what you would call net new content that's never been created before. And so that just opens up, a whole world of possibilities in terms of what you can do with these models. And you've seen some of the, early applications of those. We've certainly been, digging into some of the business applications of those, whether it's generating, email responses to your customers or summarizing large amounts of data into very targeted, concise summaries for the information you're looking for. And I think that is a huge unlock in terms of what you can do with the models. I think there's also, GPT stands for generative pre-trained transformer. And I think there's also a really interesting sort of outcome of these pre-trained models, these large pre-trained models like ChatGPT or like Palm 2, Google's model. And that is that you can actually use them for a huge variety of tasks sort of out of the box. So, in the past, like I said, you might train a model for a very specific narrow application, which will require, collecting data, having a data scientist train and optimize that model, deploying it to production with a machine learning engineer, maintaining it, updating it. And now, you can have a large pre-trained model that can do some of these same tasks, but without any customization, without that data scientist having to, train it specifically for that task. Now it can just do it out of the box. And so something like, classifying information or extracting information from an email or from a document, you can just point an off-the-shelf model at that, optimize what you call the prompt into the model and get an output. And so that will increase the velocity of what you can do with generative AI and AI in general, because you don't have all this work that goes into building these very specialized models.
So what you're saying is a plebeian like myself can actually leverage the power of this technology.
I totally think so, Gabe. I wouldn't call you a plebeian though.
I think even beyond that, this represents like a really interesting democratization of AI and its use, right? Like Peter was mentioning, the last generation of some of these approaches to machine learning required a data scientist, required a massive amount of data and a huge data set, and then also being able to understand the model that you've just created and the weights and everything like that you have to tune to make sure your model isn't overfitted and everything like this. That's like not something you have to worry about when you use these large language models. And you don't have to know really anything about machine learning so much as just, can I connect to this thing with an API and how do I make use of its responses? So I think it really starts to democratize a lot of these capabilities to organizations that maybe otherwise wouldn't have had dedicated resources to focus on building models.
That's a great point. And when we talk about democratization a lot with automation, right? With the automation success platform, with low code, no code. Like I mentioned yesterday with the demo Royale and throughout, you're seeing the ability to build these just genius solutions quickly, effectively. So to your point, Mike, I think, and I was kind of joking, but yeah, as I mentioned, I was able to participate and help build a solution using automation and Gen AI to help solve a big business problem for us. So it's just so exciting. But you guys keep saying models. I'm assuming we're not talking about Giselle and Cindy Crawford. I'm dating myself here. Talk to me a little bit about these models. What do you mean by model, and how do we choose?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the focus is on what would be termed sort of the foundation models. So that's sort of like GPT-3 or GPT-4 or Palm 2 from Google. And these are the large language models that have been built with a ton of compute and a ton of data. Generally, a lot of them are being built, obviously, by these big organizations like Google. But there's also, startups out there like Anthropic and others who are building these. And these are sort of the base or foundation of a lot of what you can do with generative AI. And then you can kind of build on top of those, whether it's through things like fine tuning or using prompting. But these base models are, something that I think will be kind of more rare or built by a lot of the sort of larger organizations because they are really expensive to build. And then, as a user of the model, you need to sort of consider, how do you choose which model to use for which application? And I think that is, I would say, an evolving space because these models are coming fast and furious. Every week there's a new model that's coming out, and Google just released their Palm 2 model, and there's lots of talk of, what's GPT-5 going to be. So this is still evolving, but as a kind of consumer or a developer building on top of these, you're looking at these models from the lens of, what are you trying to do with it and how well does it perform at that particular task? But then you also have a lot of other factors you need to look at in terms of deciding on which model should you use as that foundation. How much does it cost to serve? There's orders of magnitude difference in the cost between different models, and really large models often will be very expensive to run at scale. And you might not need such a large model depending on your task. And you also look at things like latency. You want to make sure that your data is secure. So there's lots of considerations when you start to look at these models and think about how you're going to apply them for your particular needs.
I think that gets to a really interesting topic, and Peter and I get to talk about some of this stuff at random events that we're at and things like that. So I kind of get the privilege of getting to geek out with them on this kind of thing. But Peter, you mentioned about these foundation models and how some of them are much more efficient or much smaller as far as their CPU compute requirements. I know that Palm 2 introduced some of those concepts with the different large language model sizing. I'm curious, like, how you think about the way that we do prompt engineering versus the way that we might consider actually fine-tuning some of these models with the capabilities that Google offers. And what are the pros and cons of that? And when do we go one direction versus the other?
Yeah.
Well, look, can I jump in there really quick before you answer, Peter? Can we just, for a lame-o like myself, define prompt engineering versus fine tuning?
Yeah, that's a good point, Gabe. It's really not as complex as maybe it sounds, at least on the surface. And I think it's worth that definition. So when we talk about prompts and prompting, that's really what you're inputting into the model to get a response. And so, if you just take the example that everyone's familiar with now, when you go to ChatGPT and you type something into the chat box and send it, that's basically a prompt. You've written a prompt into the model, and now you're going to get a response back from it. And so that's a very, that's the most basic approach to just, hey, I want to ask for something from a model. I'm going to put a prompt in. I'm going to get a response back. Now, the concept of fine tuning traditionally means that you're actually going to essentially retrain the model. And what that means is there's all these weights, and you hear these numbers like 540 billion parameters or 300 billion parameters. Those are the number of weights, the number of numbers essentially in that model. And when you fine tune it, you're essentially having to recalculate all of those. So as you can imagine, recalculating 500 billion parameters is computationally expensive. And you need GPUs to do that, and it takes days, and it's if it's a large model, it can take a long time. So that is a much more heavyweight thing. And what that is typically doing is you're saying, I'm going to take a data set that represents what I'm trying to do with this model. And it, you know, for a particular task, you know, you have some essentially labeled data. You're going to feed that in, and you're going to use it to recalculate all those weights in the model as part of fine tuning. So that's the difference. And I think there's a really robust, I would call it, debate over, you know, when do you need fine tuning? Do you need fine tuning at all? Can you just design your prompts in a way that they can be really optimized, or use other more computationally efficient methods to get good results without having to go through this really expensive computational process of recalculating all the weights in the model through fine tuning? So
Thank you.
I think,
Thank you.
does that make sense, Gabe? I hope I didn't make that overly
No,
confusing.
it's perfect. Honestly, it's great.
All right. Yeah, and you know, like I said, there's a robust debate over, you know, what you should do in terms of prompting, which again, simple inputs to the model versus this fine tuning. And with prompting, you know, I would recommend actually everyone, you know, who's interested in this. There's a great course by Andrew Ng on deeplearning.ai. It's free. It's about an hour and a half of content. You can get hands-on in a Jupyter notebook and test it out. And it really kind of illustrates just some pretty straightforward techniques for how you prompt these models, and sort of an iterative approach to trying different ways of phrasing things and giving examples in a prompt to get the output you want. And so that is something, you know, anyone who's developing with a large language model, I think, should be taking that at a minimum and sort of getting familiar with these sort of techniques for how to prompt these models. And then there's lots of, you know, so if you can just do that, that's obviously going to be a much simpler path for you versus having to, again, collect data and do a whole, you know, fine tuning of the model.
That's cool. We just put the link to Andrew's course in the comments, or it's about to go in there. So thanks for sharing that. Micah, what are you doing when it comes to prompt engineering when you're building your automation solutions? Like, you got any tips for the audience?
There's actually several tips that came up through bot games that I thought were really interesting, that reflecting on them are really great ideas that I would share here. And I think Steven is in the audience. He's the one who shared a couple of these. But one is actually asking ChatGPT or whatever generative AI model that you're using to maybe simplify or improve or enhance the efficiency of your prompt itself. And so for a lot of the bot games challenges, one of the things that we want to get back, or basically anytime you're really using generative AI in coordination with an automation, you're typically wanting to get back that data in some format that your automation can understand. So maybe that's JSON, maybe that's CSV, maybe that's through XML. So you want to be very prescriptive in exactly what you want out of this response. And so if I'm trying to, let's say, get the specific data out of some doctor's notes, I want to be very specific to say what data I actually want. I want to have the person's weight. I want to have their name. I want to have their age, right? I want you to look for all of that data in what I've just passed you and return it to me in a JSON that is formatted like this, right? And so I think that's a really interesting approach to actually ask the model how to better optimize the prompt that you're giving it. And then another tip that we saw, and it was very specific to reducing your tokens, right? How do I make this response and this prompt in a way that's going to reduce the tokens spent every time I make the call? So, hey, don't return it to me with all of this blank space. The demo or the example that I'm going to give you is just like comma separated. I don't have everything broken up into like a traditional formatted JSON. And that enables me to reduce the number of characters that I'm sending as a part of my request. And ultimately, that means that I'm, you know, hopefully getting a faster response, but also spending less money to do so.
Nice. I love the idea of bot games spurring these conversations where even we get feedback where we're like, oh, that's a great idea. That's super cool. And speaking of audience and community, for those of you listening, feel free to raise your hand if you got a question. We'll bring you in, and you can ask the experts here. I'm curious to know if you're leveraging Gen AI in your automations currently. For instance, what kind of obstacles are you running into right now? Is it change management type of things? Is it technical? Love to hear some of our audience weigh in on that. So speaking of the applications and the models, how do we? So we talked a little bit about, Peter, you mentioned some of the caveats or some of the considerations you want for choosing a model, right? And one of the things I think I've seen in the news and we've talked to others about is you have sort of the open models that are available, but then there's this idea of, and I don't know the proper terminology for it, but what about sort of the private model for enterprise, for instance? Like, can you talk a little bit about the differences there and what the offerings are?
Yeah, so I don't know. There's sort of kind of maybe two categories of model that are out there for foundation models right now. One is, probably the most most of the really large models today are closed in terms of they don't reveal all of the details of what's inside the model, including the data they use to train it, and also, the actual parameters in the model. And then there's a set of open source models out there that you can start to use. I think Facebook released one that is open source, but I think it's not for commercial use. So it's more for just sort of academic and exploration. But I expect there's going to be more of those open source models going forward, because that's a pretty active area of development of people wanting to open source some of this. So one of the options is to look at, an open source model that you could fully control and you can train yourself. But again, that can get quite expensive and onerous depending on, how much appetite you have to really want to, go deep on the data science and build out your own model. And then on the other side with these closed source ones, a lot of the models out there, I think, are being built in a very, responsible way in terms of what's being used to train them. And there's also a lot of kind of assurances around how your data is used, where even if you don't know all the details of the model, you can still make sure that, when you use that model, like on Google, on GCP, that data is not going to be used in any way to retrain their model or to be shared with other customers or anything like that. And that you still have full control of your data in your environment. And at the same time, you don't need to build your own model a lot of times. I think that's sort of my takeaway from the current state of things, at least, is that, these models, even if you can't rebuild or have the open source version of the model, you can, add on top of that with, there's the prompting techniques, there's options around fine tuning if you want to do that. So you can basically sort of retrain the model on your data. And there's a whole bunch of things in between, like prompt tuning or parameter efficient fine tuning. So you can kind of get that model dialed in for what you want without necessarily, having to fully take ownership and train it yourself. I think there are probably scenarios that, especially when you start to think about, customers who do want to keep their technology fully in-house on-prem or, not in a cloud service. I think that's where you'll start to see, maybe some of these open source models or custom developed models be used. But you also have to consider that, especially when it comes to the large models, they do require a lot of compute. They do require GPUs or TPUs to run and train on. So, if you're going to go down that path of building your own model, you better be, prepared to, have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that. But again, I think for most companies today, there's just so much you can do building off these kind of foundation models in a secure environment with a kind of provider you trust, like Google, or like AWS, or like Microsoft, one of the hyperscalers. that you don't really need to go down the sort of private model route unless you have very specific requirements, and you got to have the appetite to build and maintain that.
Yeah. Because it sounds like there's a robust need there. And looks like Ramana's been able to join us. So
Ramana.
Thank you, Ramana. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but I'd
hello,
like to
everyone.
From your perspective as Vice President of Engineering, when we're talking about these models, what are you looking at? What do you recommend your peers review, look at, consider when choosing these models?
Yeah, I think Peter, hello everyone, I'm Ramana Lokanathan, Vice President Engineering for Enterprise Apps and AI at Automation Anywhere. I partner and I think Peter covered it very well in terms of, for most of your needs, you either can rely on an open source models such as Bloom model, or you can use a public provider these days. Google, AWS, OpenAI have exposed their models out. You can use that, and with techniques such as prompt tuning and fine tuning, you can get most of your way out. There are special cases that I would like to add apart from what Peter mentioned. So you might be in a medical field and you want health specific LLMs. So Google has a MedPalm, which is a LLM specific for healthcare medical providers. And then we heard Bloomberg roll out a finance GPT specific for finance use cases. So there are the next evolution of the LLMs are industry specific and domain specific models. And if that is your need, yes, you can go build your own custom model, specific to your industry or your domain. But other than that, the general purpose model, they are very stable. They're expansive in terms of their ability to handle many use cases, beyond just arithmetic, question and answering, language, to other areas, such as common sense reasoning, pattern recognition, and so on. So the general purpose models are pretty robust these days.
Super cool. Thanks for that.
That's a good
I'm glad
point,
we're able to
Ramana.
get you to join. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad you're on, Ramana. Good to have you. And I think, the point about the vertical specific models like for healthcare or finance is a great one. I think that's an area that I think we're going to see a lot more of in terms of, these foundation models, but with specific flavors for different verticals where you have a lot of domain specific terminology and use cases, and being able to build a model up on top of that. I think you're going to see better performance in those domains.
Hey guys, I want to, we've got a question from the audience. It's actually a familiar face. Let's bring in Mark Goodair, who I think has a question for the panel.
Thanks, Gabe. I do indeed. Obviously, we are super interested in this topic and everything we're doing in our own automation program within Automation Anywhere. And I think this question, I think Peter and Ramana in some way kind of touched on it, but it's the question around kind of data quality, or I'll put it in other words, kind of model maturity. Anytime you see these big repositories, these models that are kind of trying to do everything, it raises a question about, are they mature in some areas, or is the quality of information better in some areas and not so great in others? And I'm just wondering if there's any kind of thought leadership or anything published these days that says, the model's real strong in these areas, but in these other areas, not so much. Is anything like that coming to the forefront, or is it more kind of trial and error based on the responses you get back? Thanks, guys.
There is and I forget the exact website, I can probably dig it up later, but Stanford has a good website that basically shows a bunch of different models benchmark against a bunch of standard benchmarks for generative or for AI in general. And so you can get, and these are more, sort of like generic tasks like question answering or extraction, document extraction, things like that. But you can get a sense of how different models perform in against these benchmarks, and really compare them that way. But then I think when it comes to your particular applications, there is a bit of that's where you have to do the due diligence. And I think over time, part of what we're doing here at Automation Anywhere is starting to build up some expertise around which models work most effectively for which applications, so that we can help to guide customers and build that into the product, so you don't have to do as much of that trial and error yourself when you want to do a particular task. So I think you'll see more of that down the road. Ramana, what else would you recommend there?
Yeah, so there are multiple levels. So first of all, there are many of these foundation models. So there is one level in terms of, okay, your application, is it related to text and speech, or is it related to question and answering, or is it related to multimodal, such as a combination of text and image? So that is one level of, one way to look at it. And the second way to look at it is within that, there is a different, I would say, stability or quality or capability. So GPT-2 is different from GPT-3, different from GPT 3.5, and now GPT-4. So that's another level. And then within those, to your question, Mark, how are these providers testing, and how good are they specific use cases? That is, this is, largely unsupervised models. They are testing specifically for certain areas. Okay, is it good at recognizing swear words? Does it take the conversation in a different direction that are not appropriate? Like, they're testing for basic scenarios such as that. Even the providers of these models are just scratching the surface in terms of its ability to do certain things. And then there are these model A performs well in the SAT exam, model B performs well in the LSAT exam, and so on. So those gives us the intelligence of this model in certain areas. So that gives some kind of an but in largely, like, what we are like, we are in a very beginning phase for our use cases. We are finding Google, for example, is very cognizant in terms of when they roll out the model. They lot of testing in terms of the applicability of it, how it is responsive in terms of language, in terms of abuse, in terms of sensitivity around certain subjects, and so on. So we find that appealing with the Google models. But beyond that, we are very new in this, and we are learning as we go.
That's really helpful. Thank you. It seems like there's lots of models coming, and lots more models, on the way. And this is going to be one of the challenges is, based on the application, which model do I choose? So that's really helpful. Thank you.
I think it would be great too if there was more transparency. I think some are already doing this, but there was more transparency across the board in terms of what data was being used to train the models, so that you kind of had that sense of one, making sure that it's responsible and it's data that you're is not going to kind of bias the models or give results that are not ideal for a sort of business application. But two, just to understand where it might have particular strengths or weaknesses. And I think some companies are already doing this and being pretty upfront about their principles in terms of which data they use to train the model. Also talking about what they call alignment, which is the sort of not tuning the model exactly, but sort of focusing the model on a particular application, but also making sure it's not generating toxic or inappropriate content and things like that. OpenAI has some good sort of blogs on this on their website you can read about. But those sorts of practices, I think, are really important. If you're going to put this into your business, you want to make sure that the data that's used to train it and the way it's aligned, all of that is aligned to your values and your principles as an organization. So you're not introducing risk into your business or jeopardizing your sort of your values as a company in terms of what the models can do.
I want to ask a really practical implementation question. Because I have both of you on here, I think this will be interesting. Let's say that I wanted to create a bot that was able to answer any question about automation anywhere, right? We just happen to work there, so this will be a good example. If I know that we already have a bunch of data in every KB article we've done, every piece of documentation we've ever had, every ticket we've ever answered and successfully closed, how do you look at me creating that kind of automation? Am I doing that through my prompt engineering? Am I doing that through, let's say, working off a foundation model and providing it all of that data to kind of train and improve it? I want to think through how you guys see solving a problem like that.
I think one of the ones that I've seen, and I want Ramana to give his opinion after this as well, but one of the ones that I've seen as an approach that I think is gaining a lot of popularity here is sort of these retrieval mechanisms. So you're not retraining the whole model with fine tuning. You're not trying to shove all the information into a prompt, but you're actually basically creating sort of like an index or inside of a vector database, all of the information you just described, Micah. So you have all your tickets, you have all your knowledge, you have everything about the company. And the first step is to do retrieval from that. So basically, when someone asks something, you're able to use this index to find the right information. And then once you have sort of found the information, you then feed it into the foundation model or the large language model to synthesize the actual targeted response to whatever question has come in. So it's sort of this sequence of things where you're combining a retrieval step with the kind of more typical generative AI, give me an answer to this question.
Yeah, I think, Peter, yeah, you're alluding to more novel way of using the large LLMs, and then rather than incurring cost, how do I, in a more cost-effective manner, train further? So, yeah, the way I would add to this, Micah, if your use cases, the use case that you mentioned, if the data that you mentioned is already on the internet, most likely, these large language models have already observed that and start by asking questions about that data, and you would be surprised, as we have been many times, its ability to understand and respond more accurately to those knowledge that's already out there. And then the second part is just using prompt tuning to actually nudge the model to think, score certain aspects of these answers higher than the other, and that's what prompt. And all it is doing is adding weights to certain parameters more than the others. And then comes the more advanced fine tuning. If the data that you have is proprietary and you need to use that in order to make the model more accurate and expansive in answering this question, then there's this fine tuning approach. Some providers provide this capability, and using that you can. And then the last way, as Peter mentioned, there is this part of the parameter efficient tuning and using vector DBs and other optimizations in order to use large content on top of a base model that is stable, and then get your problem solved. So these are some of these ways, and there are many other most advanced techniques, but I would leave it here.
Yeah, I think.
Thanks for. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Go ahead, Gim. I was just going to add to that. I think for me too, I from what I've seen, when you have a large language model, that's foundation model trained on trillions of words, if you're using these big ones, it's hard to rely on whatever information is embedded into that, because even if there's transparency, like I said, about what, did they use Wikipedia? What other data did they use to train this? There's just such a quantity of information in there that you kind of don't know in terms of the quality of what you're going to get back. It may, you hear about hallucinations and other things like that, where these models say very confidently something that is actually very factually inaccurate. And I think one of the things that, when you're doing this for a business today, at least if you're using one of those models, my rule of thumb is basically don't rely on any of the information that's embedded in that model. And the way you do that is you really kind of self-contain a problem within a prompt where you force it into doing a particular task for you, but you're not asking it an open-ended question or relying on that information that's embedded inside of the model. And that's sort of the advantage of the retrieval mechanisms combined with the model to then just do the last step, essentially, of summarizing the answer, because the information itself is now being retrieved, put into the prompt, and then given to the model in a very explicit way, so that it's not relying on, hey, what did try to pick something out of your training data that is basically that embedded, which may or may not be accurate.
Yeah. And one final point that I would make is cost is a big factor. GPT-4 can answer your questions very well, but it's 20 times more expensive than GPT-3. I don't know the actual number, but it's an order of magnitude expensive. So what we are learning very fast is that you don't need GPT-4 for all your use cases. Even GPT-2 or some of the sub models, OpenAI has Ada and Da Vinci, and depending on your use cases, you can start with a lower volume parameter model. And if that answers your question, you don't have to spend that much more and go use a more advanced and large language, a large parameter model. It doesn't, make sense. So there are techniques to actually do sub-processing before we actually make a LLM call. And those things are becoming, more prominent for us in our engineering work in order to build a feature in a more cost-effective manner.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ramana. It's like, do some of the simple tasks up front and then, minimize what you rely on a big model for, because it's expensive to run. And so that's a great way to think about sort of optimizing for cost too when you're designing these applications.
It sounds like it's going to be a key consideration as well, right? Like, it's not just go plug into the latest model. There's going to be efficiencies built in, and there's going to be previous models, for lack of a better term, that can suit the need just as well, save costs, et cetera, because efficiency, both on the solutioning part as well as the cost part, right, is what every enterprise has to think about in this day and age, of course.
Yep.
I want to again invite the community and the audience to ask their questions. We've got the experts here, so now's your time. I know that I don't know how to pronounce your name, but I think Waden had a question, and encourage you to jump back in if you. There she is. Let's bring her in and see what's on her mind. Hey, Waden, are you there? I think maybe try taking yourself off mute.
You may have to come off mute, yeah.
Okay, sorry team. Hi all. This is Wishdan Nofel, RBA Business Analyst and Room Architect. And speaking, I'm audible.
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah. And speaking of AI in RBA, I have a question here. How far are we from processing invoices or scanned documents without predefined format?
So that's a good question. We've actually been doing that for a little while. We actually have a product at Automation Anywhere called Document Automation that already uses machine learning, not necessarily generative AI, but machine learning to process invoices specifically that can vary in format and not have to train specifically for a particular format. So using machine learning, we can sort of figure out, even if things move around in the invoice, change as you're processing. You can pick up, hey, this is where the invoice number is, or this is where the address is, and things like that, without being trained on that. So that's something we're doing today. I think document processing, though, with generative AI, is now opening up a lot more possibilities. It'll probably help with that use case as well. We're looking at ways to use generative AI on top of our technology to make it even more accurate. But also, I think some of the really exciting areas of document processing that have been very hard to do in the past are now becoming much easier with generative AI. And so processing documents that are, maybe really complex, more complex than an invoice in terms of layouts, or processing unstructured documents like a contract or a resume, which, can be all over the place and there's a lot of text. Generative AI, because of its deep understanding of language, it has this ability to sort of pull out, with the semantic understanding, exactly the information that you're looking for. Like in a 100-page contract, you want to find out what's the early termination clause. Generative AI can do that very effectively. So I think when you look at the combination of automation plus, like you said, invoices or document processing, that's going to be a really exciting space. I think you're going to see generative AI sort of change everything there.
Yeah,
I
think
mentioned
pretty much with you, Peter.
I'll add one thing to that, and I would say that when I think about the hierarchy of me processing a document, right? There's the intake, the classification, the extraction, and then the validation of that data. And with invoices, you would consider that a semi-structured document, because usually they have the same data. It just moves around a little bit on the form. If you have kind of structured documents, I think the same approach would apply, as well as unstructured documents, like Peter was mentioning, where, hey, I'm going to try my first stab at extracting the data that I'm looking for. That might be through something like document automation. That might be through IQbot. That might be through some other OCR engine that I'm using. And if I get the data back and I'm able to validate that I read it correctly and it meets my confidence thresholds and it meets my data validation standards, then that's great. I can move forward. But I think you can use as a backstop these generative AI capabilities to then say, all right, I missed some of this data. Now I'm going to query generative AI with this document or with this fully OCR text, so that I can get out the data that I wasn't able to extract. And then, and only then, if I still have data that's in question or doesn't meet my validations, that's when I'm going to send that in front of a human through something like Copilot, where a human can fix and perfect the results of that extraction, so that I'm really trying everything I can to get the data out before I'm sending that to a user.
I think you nailed it, Micah. There is a method to this madness, right? So, while large language models can process semi-structured documents pretty decently, do you want to pay that much? Do you want to pay 20x the cost of doing the same? Whereas an OCR and base classification can do that, cheaply, and then add ChatGPT or LLM in order to just get your accuracy level higher, right? So that is the way to go. Today we have, what we are excited about is the innovation that these large-scale LLMs are bringing to the document processing, intelligent document processing space. Our current product has a base model is efficient enough to process general semi-structured document, invoices, purchase orders, and so on. But if your invoices are not complex, multi-page, complex line items, and so on, you can start with our product. In a matter of minutes, you can get to processing large volume of semi-structured document. And then when the cases when that is not meeting your needs, then there is heuristic feedback and then custom model training, and that will take further in terms of your ability to get exactly what you need in terms of your semi-structured document use cases.
Great question. Thank you for that. Speaking of questions, let's get to another audience member. Alex, what do you want to know? Can we get Alex in?
All right. Hey, long-time listener, first-time caller. Thanks, Automation.
Thanks for joining and thanks for the call.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question here. This is really about, what is the amount of residual data that these large language models retain from your input prompts? And this is really just in regards to corporate information, whether around customer data, sales data, or perhaps PII information.
Yeah, so that sort of depends if you're assuming you're using one of the cloud vendors, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. They each have slightly different terms. But I think they're, even today, like Microsoft as an example, if you're using their OpenAI service, you can basically specify that you want no data retained after, a prompt. You put a prompt in, you get an output out. Nothing's retained, right? I think by default, they retain data, they say, for 30 days to monitor for abuse, not for retraining, not for anything else, but just to look for misuse of the technology. But you can even, I think, apply to opt out of that. So all the way from there, and I think the other vendors have sort of similar policies where you can basically control the data in a way, if you want, where nothing is retained when you use the model. I think that's a good peace of mind for a company to know, that they have full control over the data and it's not being retained for anything. There is, however, a need sometimes for your own organization to really, have some way to, maybe it's in your own servers or it's in your own storage, to retain that, because you also want to monitor these models. So, they are, statistical, and I don't want to say unpredictable, but they have variable output. So in that way, you do want to have some sort of logging of the data so that you can monitor their performance and over time maybe improve them or flag if there's issues with them.
Great question, Alex. Thanks for participating and thanks for joining our events. We appreciate it. Guys, I know we're running out of time. I want to get one more question in. Vinay, are you there? Hi, Vinay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, very informative sessions I've been following for some time now. Thank you very much. So I have a couple of questions actually. So in terms of the AI modeling and stuff, will this AI modeling replace the learnings? Like, for example,
Could you elaborate on that, Vinay?
Yeah. So currently at this point of time, right? See, the models that have been trained on the existing data. To my understanding, all these models, they might not be able to do a new research, discover a new information, or maybe synthesize personal experiences. So I'm just trying to understand, is that the right statement, or would AI models or AI get there on the learning side of it?
Yeah, so you're largely there. When I mean what generative AI brings is a new capability of using the existing existing content to actually generate new content. It could be text, blog posts, or it could write programs. It could create poetry or could create artwork, right? Your earlier question, does it replace your learning? It instead of searching and finding results, now you're able to ask meaningful questions, have a conversation to actually fully understand the subject and the intelligence part, grasp the intelligence. And that is the wave that this generative AI has enabled us. How you make I will leave it there.
Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today for this really insightful conversation. I want to thank our audience for joining and the audience members for their questions. We love to hear your thoughts. We'd love to see what you're building. Participate with us in the social feeds, whether it's LinkedIn or otherwise. Tag us, show us what you're building, ask us your questions, ask these guys on the panel your questions, and I'm sure we're happy to help. And we're excited to see what you build next. Until next time, I'm Gabriel Correjo with Automation Anywhere, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.